Alrighty, good morning, everybody. Looks like we're live now officially. Good morning. All right, let that buffer for a second, and then we'll jump right into it. Before I get too far into this, a couple observations I've made from the battlefield there over in Ukraine. I was just mulling this over. So, not long ago, I'd contended with or debated starting a surplus retailer type setup, mostly going to local flea markets or militaria shows and things. I do have a pretty extensive collection myself. And morning, Joe. Hope the weather out there is treating you nicely. I know that it's been quite extreme, Avan City. And surplus and like the nature of surplus has become kind of a weird and sad animal in that a lot of items are no longer really surplus. Everything is kind of shifting into the collector market. And that even includes like West German or Bundeswehr items. And one of the reasons a lot of the West German and really the Bundeswehr stuff dried up over the last couple of years has to do with what's going on in Ukraine. I've actually seen, and if you pay attention, especially early on, tons and tons of West German and Bundeswehr equipment was pouring in and being used. And you still actually see it sporadically on some of the Ukrainian paramilitary forces there, though they have definitely transitioned more into domestic production stuff. And then even items that you would find, at your local tactical retailers and things like that. A lot of multicam, which is actually adding to that fog of war problem because the Russians also use a lot of multicam. I've noticed a lot of the Donbass guys use a lot of multicam. The thumbnail from today's video is a couple guys from the Donbass region. I'm not sure which paramilitary group exactly, but it's kind of interesting. And it creates a lot of logistical problems when everybody's running around the same uniform. Not good. But we know the Russian special forces, for example, like to run around in a lot of uniforms that look remarkably similar to NATO. And there's probably a good reason for that, right? If you're sitting on an observation post and you see a squad of guys move across the field, you're going to hold your fire because they look exactly like you. So it's going to create a lot of delay in action. And it would certainly enable them to cause a lot of mayhem behind the lines if you look exactly the same as your Western counterparts. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into this. Right now, the doomsday clock is sitting at 100 seconds to midnight. Something to keep in mind as you're going about your preps, as you look at the existing inventory in your stores, especially big appliances and things like that. I made a little short video on that the other day, that a lot of stuff is still very back ordered. And I think a lot of the delivery dates that they're putting out there are somewhat optimistic, that they actually expect that they're going to be able to deliver a lot of these items when they are either entirely imported or they rely so heavily on stuff that is imported. And given the complete transition into a service-based economy that we now live in, there's really no good quick fix for this. I hit on this in the last live stream. As great as it would be to go 100% American on everything, it's just not even really that feasible. And then a personal anecdote, as I mentioned, wanting to possibly open my own surplus type business, vending military gear and things like that. I was actually in touch with a vendor from Russia before all of this started, where there are massive stockpiles and really good resources for tactical gear, clothing, apparel, that type of stuff. This hat actually came from one of those vendors, and I wanted to see what the quality was, so I ordered a couple pieces, and we were chatting back and forth, and then everything popped off, and then suddenly the embargoes were put in place, and they're like, yeah, we can still ship from a couple of the countries over here, but we're running into some logistical problems as this continues. And so the other day I went to go check and see what was going on, and now their entire eBay store has been shut down. Effectively. It says that they are now on vacation until 2031. And you're going to see more and more of that as East and West splits apart. A lot of people who are relying on imported product from the Eastern world, they're just not going to be able to get it. Now that we're seeing India more closely align with China and Russia, that's definitely really concerning because there are a lot of things that we also obtain from India. Clothing, I know a lot of knives. There's a lot of products, jewelry, tons of jewelry is made in India. And we're going to see a major impact on the global trade setup as we have it, that globalist type trade. Be careful the keywords I use here on this platform, right? But because we're in a globalist and a global economy where we are all hyper dependent upon one another, especially in the West, where we really need those Eastern supply chains to be functioning. Without those, we're going to be in dire straits pretty quickly. So the other thing to look at, as I mentioned, with the 100 seconds to midnight on the doomsday clock, the human cost of all of this is really, really disastrously bad. And I'll put a link to a YouTuber that I've been following over the last week or two. He's an American journalist who has been living in Donbass for quite some time, and he was able to get to the scene of a lot of things very quickly, especially around Mariupol, which is a complete disaster. Without really good Western media outlets going in there, and this is the big problem with all of this, because they don't want to show us the totality of what's going on for any number of reasons. There's no power, there's no water. Basically, every single high-rise has been hit by a strike. They're all burned to pieces. All the glass is broken and gone. The place is uninhabitable at this point, especially as we roll into winter. There's lots of looting. And then we're seeing a lot of people who are trying to bug out by vehicle from Mariupol, which is really important to pay attention to if you're into preparedness, emergency preparedness, because they waited too long. When they knew that the Russian army was going to be there, there's that moment of like, do I go now? Do I go later? What do I do? There's always that discussion in the preparedness world of when is the right time to leave. And for a lot of these people, they're literally sitting in miles and miles and miles of just backed up cars trying to evacuate the area. And so what they've done is they've tied, and I don't know if this was an order from the Russian military or the paramilitary groups in the area, that, you know, to show you're a non-combatant, tie white fabric onto your car. So you'll see door handles, rear view mirrors that all have just strips of white fabric hanging off of them. And they're not making any headway. They're literally parked at this point. So you're going to see a lot of vehicles breaking down. A lot of people are going to have to resort on walking and heading out on foot. And it's just an all-around bad situation for the people who live in that area. You know, had they, in hindsight's 2020, left weeks ago, this wouldn't have been nearly as dire of a situation for most of those people. By the time you get the inkling, you know, a lot of the normies out there to leave, it's probably too late. The people who left weeks and weeks ago when this initially happened from major cities, you'll notice they didn't take very much with them. They just knew in their gut that this was the time to go. And they were likely right, unfortunately. One of the big things that I've noticed too, and because so many people are vehicle dependent, that they've likely made no preparations in terms of their new status as a refugee. Something to consider, especially if you have family or friends in Europe, depending on where they're living. Maybe they should have some stuff pre-staged in a neighboring country. Maybe they rent a storage unit in like Poland or something, and then use that as a place or a point to regroup once they're issued the right credentials to be able to move around that area, because simply having to rely on the kindness of NGOs and then the host government is not always going to be the best plan, especially as resources become more and more limited. And those countries have to begin really being more concerned with taking care of their own people and their own military needs. The refugees are going to become a very secondary thing on a long enough timetable. And a big thing to keep in the back of our head too, and I was talking with a friend who's a Navy veteran about this the other day, and when militaries say that they have X amount of vehicles available for war, let's say they have, for example, Poland says they have 5,000 tanks. Okay, that's cool. How many of them actually work right now? How many, if they had to fuel them up right now, could they go and deal with the Russians in? So we joked, we're like, I don't know, 3,800, 3,900 of them are probably operational. The rest of them are either in boneyards or they're pulling parts, or they move them around for aerial reconnaissance purposes. When the Russians have their satellites overhead, they'll move them around, make it look like 1,000 of these are functional, and they have no engines in them. I was even at a military museum not long ago, and one of the aircraft that was on display is still in active use by the U.S. Air Force. And the person giving us the tour mentioned that there were Air Force personnel in there only a month or two earlier pulling parts off of this plane that's on semi-permanent loan from the Air Force. So think about that, right? And the same is true for any military unit around the world. No one actually has the amount of vehicles up and running that they claim to do. They're mostly, again, a good portion of them, maybe 2/3, 3/4 are actually operational, and the others are just basically junked. So the Russians are keenly aware of this too. They know that there's a lot of subterfuge in this, and they do the same type of blustering when they might say they have X amount of operational aircraft or X amount of operational tanks. But the big thing too, and that we need to keep in mind, is that we're no longer the world's top nuclear power. I don't expect with 100% certainty by any means that things are going to go nuclear in Europe, because they plan on occupying a lot of Europe, potentially, right? I don't know about our side of the ocean, right? How much boots on the ground activity they have planned, probably none. So you do need to make some level of preparation for that, right? We've talked about NBC filters. I've touched on TICHEM suits would definitely be something to look into as the supplies dwindle and completely disappear. I've noticed the pricing on a lot of this stuff has skyrocketed over the last few weeks. The big retailers like Amazon are out of a lot of the TICHEM 2000 suits, and that would be like the lowest level of protection. Those were $10 to $15 suits. Consider them a one-time use thing. Those are pretty much no longer available. There are more premium options that are still out there, and if you want to look more into that, I would encourage you to do so. Again, I think the risk is low, but one of the things we do need to keep our eye on, the fact we have maybe 3,500 plus nukes, 3,800 nukes, something like that operational in the US. Russia has over 5,000. And the big thing right now, and I haven't seen a lot of people hit on the fact that there's a lot of anti-submarine warfare training that's going on right now, and they're billing it as training. And they're expanding the list of nations that are participating in this type of training around the world right now. About a week ago, there was mention that the U.S. Navy was participating in joint operations with the Colombian Navy. And that would be easy enough to write off as if they were doing this in some type of anti-narco war type action, because they do use submarines to transport product. But that's also a really nice, convenient way of hiding the fact that they're actively potentially looking for Russian nuke subs, which really that capability should not be underestimated, because we would have virtually no advanced warning if one was successfully able to pop something off in our direction. That being said, though, and I keep pointing out, a lot of this is far more survivable than we would realize if you're not directly near the blast zone. So there are certainly, again, protective measures that you can take. And then if you go and look at some of the footage from the end of World War II in Japan, from Hiroshima in particular, there are a lot of people who were literally less than 1,000 yards from the blast that lived and were not horribly wounded, and they're still alive today. So as long as you have some protection, maybe you're inside, as long as I said you're not directly under it, the likelihood of survival is a lot higher than you would realize. And as long as it's an airburst weapon, about 90% of the radiation will dissipate after about 72 hours. So that's just something to keep at the back of your head. Based on what we know about existing weapons, it's the stuff that we don't know about that I think will certainly be interesting. Hopefully we never find out what new technologies are out there. I don't want us to, and I'm sure you don't want us to either. The other big escalation I'm sure that you have seen lately is the Switchblade 600 drone systems that we have given to Ukraine, or that we will be shipping. On that note, the video I made about the foreign volunteers who were fleeing the country, that strike, it turns out, killed like 276 foreign volunteers. Now they're admitting that it was not Ukrainian nationals who were mostly killed in that strike. On that base, there were also hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weapons the United States had just sent in. So they're going to keep targeting places like that And it's likely that a lot of weaponry will never make it to the front line, as it's pretty clear at this point that Ukraine no longer maintains any type of air superiority. Uh, as much as we want to talk about the ghost of Kiev and all that type of psyop nonsense that's going on right now, we want to keep underestimating, and they want to keep telling us that Russia is ill-equipped and ill-prepared, but then we see stuff like that strike occur, or their hypersonic missiles. This is not a third world military. It's not. Now, as I pointed out, the only reason that they pulled so many old vehicles out of dry storage was simply to serve as an occupation army. There's a lot of nonsense going on right now that they're poorly trained. As I pointed out in another video recently, watch how the Russian troops react to contact. Watch how they get off the X in an ambush, how they dismount, how they establish a base of fire, and how the units behind them begin to maneuver on the ambush position. That takes training and rehearsal. That's not something that people would know to do organically. These are well-trained individuals. Even if they're reservists or Russian National Guard, whatever the case is, they know what they're doing. A lot of the foreign volunteers who were pouring in have no clue what they were doing. And they are putting themselves in great peril, thinking that they can absolutely do anything at this point other than become cannon fodder. There's a reason why a lot of them were not being issued weapons very early on in all this, mostly because the weapons that Ukraine needs, they're being sent to the front immediately. And they don't want guys who don't have experience on the front. They don't want them there. Anytime that they've gone out, there's been horrendous casualties per the Redditors. So that's been one of the more reliable sources of information in this conflict. You can't buy what you're seeing in a lot of the corporate media. And we can even only get a snapshot just from the social media stuff too, right? But they're not a third world army, and it should not be taken lightly. It really should not be taken lightly. And I expect that they will use some more wonder weapons in the immediate future that we were not expecting, or that technologically we had no idea even existed. That'll be the true shock when that eventually gets pulled out. And again, hope that doesn't happen, but based on some of the things coming out there, it's easy to surmise that we will get involved on a higher level than we already are. We've already been responsible for the deaths. U.S. weapons or NATO-supplied weapons have been responsible for the deaths of at least 5 high-ranking Russian officers, allegedly, per the Ukrainians, 4 colonels, and a general. I suspect I know where these attacks occurred or how they occurred. A lot of the command staff is likely using lightly armored cars, and we've seen a number of videos come out from that area where these ambushes have been popped off against 1, 2, or maybe 3 of them moving in a column. So some of those attacks might have been staff officers or some of the command troops, some of the because those generally would serve kind of as a command vehicle anyway, unless they are moving, constabulary guys or some of the occupation forces around. So we're probably seeing a mix of that right now. But I think that's likely how a lot of those guys were hit, is they were rolling around in a command car and they were ambushed by an in-law, which, again, on a long enough timetable, continuing to do that, the fact that we are the ones supplying it, Russia has already put it out there that they will begin targeting potentially the aircraft or the supply chains directly. Why wouldn't they? Everything we're doing is an act of war right now. There was a tweet put out by, if I can find his name, there was a tweet put out by a guy who has worked for the New Yorker, Rolling Stone. He's a military intel type guy. That's his reporting. He's a military veteran himself. And he put out a tweet suggesting that we already have special forces on the ground in Ukraine, which would not be surprising if that's the case, that they're doing prep work for something potentially much larger. He then deleted the tweet, or Twitter deleted the tweet. Again, grain of salt, why that disappeared. Maybe it wasn't accurate either, right? But if it was, it's definitely setting the stage for something larger. Do I see the draft coming back? Maybe. That's a distinct possibility. I think, again, this conflict will remain more than likely mostly conventional. And if it does, they're going to need to backfill a lot of positions. I think the biggest problem we're going to have, and there was a letter that was signed by almost 30 retired generals that came out, I want to say about 5 or 6 years ago, warning that the current military readiness of the country was not there. That with the current body mass index of a lot of the country, that they would have to pretty much write off the majority of young military-aged men, which is a national security problem. Our military as a whole, a lot of the experienced guys have been getting out over the last 5-10 years. Most people who are serving on active duty right now have never deployed, have never seen combat. A lot of the experienced guys are gone. I think that they may end up trying to recall a lot of those people if they weren't discharged for medical reasons. But a lot of stuff that people were exposed to, the TBIs they received, all that kind of stuff, a lot of your guys who have been to war zones have some type of service-connected disability. So that right there will even impact our readiness, because again, that's the guys who could really effectively deal with Russian troops who are quickly becoming very hardened in this conflict. And we're going to be sending a bunch of green guys over there. Now, there was a video put out, I forgot the guy, he was reviewing some of the current Army basic training stuff, the OSET stuff. And I'll be honest, a lot of that training is not great. A lot of the basic level training, there's a lot of attitude from the cadre, the instructors, that, oh, you'll learn this when you get to your unit. What if I don't? What if I go right to my unit and then something big happens and you have to like go off to war? This logic of, oh, you'll just learn it at your unit is not a good philosophy. And I expect that still exists today. Our training is not great. It's decent primer level stuff. So you could certainly learn more advanced things, but the average soldier, if they want to learn more advanced soldiering skills, they're probably going to have to go spend money on that, especially when it comes to some of the urban warfare training, that type of thing, actual survivability in those environments, because a lot of what Big Army teaches, the dynamic entry, all that type of stuff, is designed around the philosophy that there is a certain level of acceptable casualties. They're not teaching you the type of stuff that like a SWAT team would do. The only time typically that a SWAT team would use any of that type of dynamic stuff at this point would be like a hostage rescue. Generally, they're going to move through that really slow. They're going to really slowly pie corners. That's the type of stuff you'll see often like special forces utilizing, or like 3-letter organizations utilizing, because they are not trying to deal with Big Army casualties, right? They're trying to avoid a lot of that. So when they come in and get to advise some of these foreign militaries, I hope they've imparted some of that skill set to them, that, hey, there are better, more efficient ways to do this where you can reduce your casualties by moving through these homes a little differently, or not utilizing the old school patrols down the middle of the road in an urban area. You see millennials failing big time as new recruits at the draft comes. They're going to have to do a lot of restructuring of how they do things, because there's a big difference between dealing with a volunteer force and dealing with a conscripted military. It's going to be a big wake-up call to the nation should this have to happen. I think you're going to see revisions of the draft too, where women are inevitably included, because they're going to need women to backfill the positions that men will not be able to backfill due to the obesity problem. And you may see a lot more CrossFit, or a lot more like pre-recruit type programs. They might expand, like they have the recruit sustainment program. So they may bring in people who are otherwise fairly healthy, besides the fact that they're overweight, and then hold them there and try and encourage that weight loss, where they just stay at the retention battalions for a longer period of time. or not the retention battalions, but the, I forgot the terminology for it. Those first, the processing units, the units that expressly, all they do is they in-process people into their respective branch. When you get to basic training, they sit there and each branch calls it things a little differently, but you get there, you literally just get your uniforms issued, you go to your doctor's appointments, all that type of stuff. They put you in front of an optometrist, they see if you're colorblind or not, all these things. But they could certainly leave people there who are grossly overweight and make them not overweight before sending them off. I think the amount of injuries you're going to see due to this is going to be shocking. You're going to get a lot of people who get injured, who have all kinds of problems because they've never really done anything physical in their entire lives. Government's not going to care. Not at all. You're talking about major expansions, though, of veteran affairs, but they'll figure out a way likely to injure a bunch of people and then get them to sign paper to where the government then won't even be responsible for taking care of those injuries because that's how they be. So that was one of the things I was hitting on in that foreign volunteer video, how important it is that, should you decide to go to Europe and fight, you should do it for like a legitimate government. You shouldn't be going over there to one that has pissed away years of military readiness opportunity and now is finding itself backed into a corner. Because when you get injured, if you get injured, and they're not going to take any accountability for that, right? You're going to be on your own paying for all your medical bills, even therapy. Should you find yourself with post-traumatic stress, that's all going to fall on you. And there'll be no pension. There'll be nothing for you. So it's not a great plan to go do that without knowing the risk, right? Yeah, half the adult population is overweight. Depends on the country. Gosh, it seems like more than half of the adult population is overweight, especially over the last several years. People have really packed on the poundage. Just a basic observation, which brings me to something I'm going to tease again. This will give you a few weeks because I'm not going to fully launch this until I get closer to 1,000 subs. And I want to get physically in better shape before I create this competition where the goal here is working on strength and weight loss will play into it, really body mass index, but your physical strength improvements is really what we want to monitor here. And I'll come out with some standards to kind of follow. Make sure to consult your doctor before doing any of this. But as part of the giveaway, the winner will receive this case. It's a North American Rescue branded case from 1110 Gear, and it comes with this brand new staged cat tourniquet, ready to rock and roll, never used. Consider these a one-time use item. So I will be giving that away to the winner once I get that rolling and set up all the parameters for that. So make sure you're subbed here and stay tuned for that if that's something that interests you. Yeah, exactly half the population is overweight in the U.S. As I harped on, this is a really big problem. And it's something we have to be really cognizant of. And as I mentioned too, with what we're seeing with the refugee situation over in Europe right now, what percentage of those people aren't leaving because they physically can't? And I would tell you that it's far more than you would realize, especially when you begin to see people in these areas being interviewed. A lot of the younger people are staying because they have older relatives or family members who really can't easily exfil the area. You're seeing a lot of elderly people who are being left behind because either their family moved away years ago or they just can't leave. And it's really sad to see that. But that's why it's so important that you have to take care of your fitness and you have to be able to walk. You have to be able to walk. That is your most crucial survival skill. It's the skill that has gotten us this far as a species, was our ability to walk incredibly long distances. That's how our relatives ended up in the places that they were. It's how we got to where we are. As part of my family's departure from Europe, they had to walk literally a few thousand miles to get to where they needed to go. I'm sure they took some trains and things too along the way, and they just hyped up the story. But it brings and strikes a pretty valid point here that as these highways and things get clogged, as people keep trying to drive their cars out of Ukraine, a lot more people are going to have to resort to walking on foot, especially as roads get destroyed. especially as more and more infrastructure gets wrecked there, because there are now huge areas that no longer have electricity, that no longer have utilities. How long do you think you can stay in a building that was designed around the grid being a functional thing? Like, most modern homes are not built to be sustainable without electricity, without basic utilities. So the idea that you could stay once the power goes out in most places is simply, it's just not realistic. I mean, sure, bugging out, we always hit on this in the Western preparedness world. We always say, oh, well, bugging out's a death sentence. Sometimes staying can be a death sentence, especially with, again, what we're seeing in Europe. Like, you have to try and look at the big picture, figure out what the defining moment would be for your family to make that decision that, hey, it is time to go. Again, the people who are going to survive are the ones who leave early, who people and most of the population will look at them like they're a crazy person for leaving that area. And the people who are actively putting stuff back right now, they're going to double down on criticizing you for doing that. With all of what's going on right now, and I mentioned the appliances and things at the beginning of this, and seeing that there's still a backlog of freezers and refrigerators, anyone who's switched on and actively preparing, even just your fitness, which is your most important survival tool, they're going to continue to double down on the individuals who try to put stuff back. The language that they've been using over the past 2 years, they've been calling people hoarders, while other governments are more responsibly telling people, especially in Western Europe, that, hey, you should have at least a month worth of provisions on hand. A month. Most Americans maybe have 72 hours worth of stuff on hand. That's what FEMA recommends too. They say at least 72 hours. So if our government says 3 days, and let's look at how long it took the government to respond to any number of serious events like Katrina. Like, there were areas where government resources didn't get there for a few weeks, right? And not in any meaningful way. Maybe they tossed a case of MREs, but you're on your own. You have to be able to deal with things as if you are the first responder, because you're the one that's there. So if your body can't handle the stress of a major event, if your body can't deal with the physical labor needs of a major event, there's a problem, and you need to begin changing your routine, your habits, your lifestyle to better fit the hard world that we're transitioning into right now. So I hope that, some giveaways and things, and acting as a kind of a support group, if you will, for our fitness goals will motivate more people to get off the couch and take this all very seriously. The other big thing, though, that I do want to hit on before I dip out today is, as we continue to put things back and prepare, keep in mind that pricing on everything is going up, and that your major big box stores, and we may even see the credit card companies hop in on this. I've seen a number of channels mention the fact that we're going to move into an era where we have a lot of rationing. And I think they're right. But I think a lot of it will come from the private sector. Maybe you've made one too many transactions at a Walmart in the course of a day. Maybe you've bought too much of something, right? So they'll figure out ways to crack down on people if you're not using mostly cash, I suspect, at some point. And then maybe the government imposed stuff will come in later. But I think because of how wildly unpopular that proposal would be, I think that you're going to see a lot of people who shift away from certain political parties if they bring that in. So they're not necessarily going to be a big fan of wanting to do it themselves, but simply using their private sector friends to do that for them, I think will eventually be the thing. But yeah, I mean, expect even limits on, again, that's why I mentioned the big stuff now, because if you need to replace a refrigerator, if you need tires, if you need any number of high demand things to live, you should probably look into that sooner rather than later before that gets imposed. If anyone has anything else they'd like to add, please do so in the chat. Otherwise, I'm going to probably wrap things up here. Oh, I guess, and then one other thing I did want to hit on too on those Switchblade drones that we're going to give to Ukraine, if even any of them really make it to the battlefield in any meaningful way, uh, as the U.S. is responsible for more and more damage to Russian owned equipment and responsible for causing more and more casualties, they're going to find ways to further hurt us economically, of course. Um, I think that's also the reason we're seeing a lot of that anti-submarine warfare stuff, because I expect we'll see a lot more cables and things cut. We've talked about that a little bit recently too on some of these live chats where submarines have clearly been going after some of the cables and things laid out across the ocean. So that's something else to keep in mind too, is having alternate means of communication. That would be hugely important if you don't have a ham license, or at least have the radios and know how to operate them. I would recommend getting the licenses too. That way you can get more and more comfortable transmitting and receiving and just seeing just how far you can push that radio, especially on some of the repeater networks we have here in the United States are super, super good. But if the grid were to go down, they'll only run maybe for a few weeks potentially before those are no longer usable, which is why I would encourage, if you have the resources, to get an even higher end ham radio and the higher tier licensing, because that will enable you to broadcast a much further distance. Not that people will necessarily be able to respond to you, but that's something to keep in mind once the repeater networks go down. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in and listening to my daily rambles on the situation in Ukraine and everything else that's going on. Again, keep doing what you're doing. Make sure to double down on your fitness. Consult your doctor before doing anything if you're in a position to need to do that. Gym memberships are not crazy expensive. If you don't have a lot of good equipment at home, it's also not a necessity. You have the outdoors, you have your living room, you can do all kinds of body weight things right now. Definitely focus on that. Thanks for watching.